Today's daf is daf Chav Tes, and we'll start with Masechet, which is the second line from the top. Now the Gemara raises an objection to Rabbi Zera from our Mishnah. Now we'll explain how this works out in just a minute. The Mishnah says, over achore beis hakneses, o sheyebeso samach beis hakneses v'shama kol shofar kol milah, im kivein libo yotza, im lav lo yotza. So he's walking by a shul, he hears the shofar blowing, or let's say his garden is right next door to the shul, so he's out there in his back porch and he hears the shofar, or he hears the Megillah, and as long as he had kavanah, he's yotze. This is against Rabbi Zera, because Rabbi Zera had ruled that it's not enough that you hear the shofar and have kavanah. You have to also make sure that this kavanah is mashmiya, which means tokea, that the blower also had kavanah. And here, he's blowing inside the Beis Knesset. Somebody's walking by outside the Beis. He doesn't have him in mind. What good is it if he has kavanah? But the one who's blowing doesn't have him in mind. And the Gemara says, when someone is blowing as a shliach tzibur, or in the case of Megillah, reading the Megillah as a shliach tzibur, he has in mind anyone. He doesn't specify who he has in mind. And he has a general kavanah that encompasses everyone. We learned in a brayso, niskaven hashomeh, below niskaven hamashmiah, niskaven hamashmiah, below niskaven hashomeh lo yotza, ad niskaven shomeh mashmiah. We need that the tokea have in mind that he's blowing on behalf of the shomeh. And the shomeh has to have in mind that he's being yotze the mitzvah through the tkiyah of the tokea. Ktoni, it says in the brayso, mashmiah dumyid the shomeh. From the fact that the brayso in one breath combines these cases of kavanah samashmiah, one who's blowing, and the kavanah of the shomeh, the one who's listening, then they should be equal, on equal grounds. They're uniform. They're brought together in one sentence, in one breath. Ma shomeh. Shomeh liatzmo. Apparently, we're talking about a person who has to hear for himself. He's not being motzi anyone else. He's just listening. He can't be motzi anyone else. And by analogy, by equation, af mashmiah, the mashmiah case is also where he has in mind himself. Mashmiah liatzmo. Ukitani lo yotza. And this is difficult according to Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera says you need that the mashmiah have kavanah and the shomeh have kavanah. Here we're saying that if the mashmiah would have kavanah to be mashmiah li'atzmo, and the shomeh had kavanah to be shomeh li'atzmo, then they would have fulfilled their mitzvah. And this doesn't make any sense according to Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera holds it's not sufficient that you have kavanah to be motzi yourself. You as the mashmiah, as the shofar blower, have to have in mind to be motzi the person who's listening. And here it just seems to imply that all you need is the kavanah to be yotze when you blew the shofar, and you yotze for yourself, not for someone else. And the Gemara says Tanoihi, this issue about whether the tokea, the mashmiah, has to have in mind that he's blowing on your behalf is in fact a machlokas Tanoi. Now, the Gemara is going to analyze a brayso in the following methodology. If the brayso brings a ratio without any name to it, it's anonymous, and then in the sefer, it has a qualification of that din that's brought in the ratio by quoting someone else, then the assumption is that the ratio, which is anonymous, represents the opinion of the Tanakama, as opposed to the sefer, which quotes a Tana. So let's see how that applies in this price. The price said, Shomea liatzmo, mashmiya lefi darko. And what this means is that the Shomea hears the shofar, and he's being mechamin to be yotze with this kol shofar. The mashmiya who's blowing, he's blowing lefi darko, meaning he doesn't have to have kavanah to be blowing on behalf of the shomeh. That's the opinion of Tanakh. And on this, Rabbi Yossi disagrees. It was, oh, Rabbi Yossi, but medvar murin. This is not so. It's not correct that if the mashmiya, the blowing, the person who blows the shofar has kavanah for himself, that's sufficient. And if he has kavanah without any specific person in mind to be motzi him, that person can be yotzi if he has kavanah as the shofar. No. But medvar that only applies to the shliach tzibur, who has in mind everyone who will hear it. But yachid, if an individual is blowing up half himself, and he doesn't have in mind the shomer, that he's being motzi the shomer, lo yotza, the shomer is not yotze, ad she's kamen ha-shomer, ve'ha-mashmiya. It's not sufficient that the shomer hear the shofar, but like Rabbi Zera said, Rabbi Yossi says that the mashmiya also has to have kavanah, if he's a yachid, specifically to be motzi this shomer. So again, according to Tanakama and the brayso that the Gemara brought before, you don't need the mashmiya to have kavanah for the purpose of the shomer. And if he has kavanah liatzmo, that's sufficient. But Rabbi Yossi holds, like Rabbi Zera, that you need both the kavanah of the shomer and the mashmiya as well. Now, once the Mishnah had spoken about kavanah in shofar, the Mishnah actually has a gadol, this is a little bit rare, to expand on this idea of kavanah. In the parsha of the Milchama against Amol, it says in Parshas Bishalach, V'hoya kasher yored Moshe yodo v'garva Yisrael, when Moshe lifted up his hands towards the Shamayim, then the Jewish people who were fighting on the ground, the battle against Amalek was successful. And the question of the Mishnah is, V'chiyadav shal Moshe osos milchama, how could it be that the arms of Moshe are causing the success, the victory in the war? O shovros milchama, or they lose chas v'shalom the war if Moshe's yadayim are not up. Ella, but rather, what is the pasuk telling me? Lomer kol zman sheho yisrael b'staklim klapi malo, when the Jewish people would turn their eyes upward, heavenly, u'mishabdim eslim alavim shabashamayim, and they had a sense of hachna. It means they subjugated themselves to the will of God. Then they would be successful over the Amaleki. But in Lav, if the Yadayim of Moshe were not lifted up towards Shamayim and Klal Yisrael were not Meshabnim Eslimam, they would lose the war. Kayotzik Adav. And we find something very similar in the parsha of the Nachash HaNechoshes. What happened was the Jewish people came to complain to Moshe that he took them out from Mitzrayim into the wilderness. There's no bread, there's no water, and all they have is the man, and it was kind of sick of the man. So Hashem punished them by sending a chashim srafim, that were these very dangerous killer snakes were biting them. And Hashem says to Moshe, at the end of this whole episode, to terminate this terrible calamity of the serpents that were killing Jews, make a kind of an image of a serpent, and lift it up on high. The pasuk seems to indicate that anyone who was bitten by a serpent would just look up at this facsimile of a serpent and he would be okay. And he would survive. Is it true that the nachash that Moshe created would determine whether they would live or they would die? That doesn't make any sense. Ella, when they would lift up their eyes heavenly, and they felt a sense of accepting the will of God and committing themselves to such famous rapping, they would become healthy. If they wouldn't look up on top, and they wouldn't be mishabed asleep, they would actually die from the toxic poison of the nachash, the venom of the serpent. So all that is agarata. Now at the end of the Mishnah, we get some halacha in. Eresh, shota v'katan, ein motziin tzarabim yidei chovasan. We're talking about serving as a shliach tzibur for tkiyah shofar, to blow the shofar on behalf of the tzibur. And the principle is that if you're chayav, you can be motzi others. But these three categories mentioned here in the Mishnah, Cherich of Katan, are potter. The Katan is potter because he's less than 13. And the Cherish is potter for the same reason that the Shota is potter. And that means that we're talking about a Cherish, She'eno Shomea, he doesn't hear. And the question is, does he speak? Is he capable of speak? You could have a mute, deaf mute, or you could have someone who's deaf, but he's not mute. In the Masechet, he quotes Chachmei Achronim, that's apparently how it's passed in the Shulchan Aruch, that here the word Cherish means that he's deaf. And he speaks. And even though generally speaking, whenever you see the word Cherish, it means that he's deaf and mute, but here there's an exception to the rule. And even a Cherish HaMedaber, but since he's Eino Shomei, he's potter. Because the mitzvah is to hear the shofar. Not to blow the shofar, but to hear the shofar blasts. And once he doesn't have the capacity to hear the shofar blasts, he is therefore exempt. And if he's exempt, he cannot blow on behalf of anyone else. Zeh klal. Now the Mishnah ends with a general rule. Kol she'eino mechuyev b'davar, eino motzi esarav yidei chomos. The halach of Arvis of Yotza Motzi means that I can be Motzi you because we share the same chiyuv. But if I don't have that chiyuv, I cannot do the action on your behalf to be Motzi you. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa. Akol chayav b'tkiyah shofar kohanim leviim v'Yisraelim gerim v'avodim v'shuchrarim. In every one of these cases, we're going to have to try to figure out what's the chiddush. I mean, kohanim are included in all mitzvahs, so leviim, so Yisraelim, obviously. Why would I think otherwise? That the Brisa felt compelled to have to notify me that these categories of Jews are chayiv in the mitzvah. Gerim v'avodim v'shuchrarim, they're also full-fledged Jews. Why would I think otherwise? V'tumtum. This is a little more complicated. Tumtum means that his genital area is covered over by a thick membrane, so we cannot know whether underneath he has zachrus or he has nachrus. So he's a safek zachar, safek nekeva. And on the tzad that he's in a keva, or she's in a keva, I guess you'd say, then she's part of the mitzvah of shofar, because shofar is the mitzvah say, shazman grom noshim peturos. Androgynous, who has both simon and both genitals of zachrus and nachrus, and it's a suffix whether we classify him as a male or as female, then such a person is obligated in shofar misafik. So we have tumtum and androgynous, both cases, but we're not sure if they're male or female, and therefore they're obligated to hear the shofar midin suffix. And we'll see later on that they cannot be motzi someone else because of the tzad that maybe they're parted from the mitzvah. Chorin is also chayiv b'shofar because half of him is ben chorin, means two people, two Jews, were partners over an Eved Kanani. One of them was meshacher his half, the other was not. The one that was meshacher his half gave the Eved a status of a chatzi ben chorin, but his other half, where the other partner was not meshacher, that he remains a chatzi Eved. He's chayiv in shofar because he has a tzad of a ben chorin. And now the Brisa continues. Tumtum eino motzi lo esmino v'lo she'eino min. Why? A tumtum, let's say I have two people that are both tumtums. One of them might be a male, the other might be a female. And therefore we're going into a suffix situation and we cannot allow one of them to be motzi the other in shofar because it could be that the one who's blowing the shofar actually is a female and the one who's listening to the shofar is in truth a male, and a female cannot be motzi a male. So therefore, lo she'eino min. And in a she'eino min case, where a tumtum is blowing shofar on behalf of someone who's normal and fine, in that case, you have a suffix, maybe the tumtum is in a keva, and therefore he cannot be motzi she'eino mino. Androgynous, however, has one advantage, although he cannot blow or she cannot blow on behalf of someone else who's normal, but motzias mino, on the other hand, every androgynous belongs to the same category. We're not sure what that category is, whether it's feminine or masculine, but whatever it is, it is. So all androgynuses are in the same boat, so to speak. They're all equal. Because maybe he's in a keva and cannot be motzi a zachar in shofar. Motzi lo esmino below es she'eno mino. He cannot blow the shofar even on behalf of another person who's also a chetzia eved chetzia ben chorin. Why? Because the half ben chorin, the half eved shabo is part of the mitzvah. That half is interfering with the tekiah because the tekiah now is the tekiah also from the eved shabo. Obviously, because he has the tzad of avdu shabo, which is part of the tekiah shofar. He can't be motzi a full-fledged ben chorin. The Gemara now analyzes this price. Omar Mar, the price says chayovim b'tkiyas shofar kohen levim yisrael pshita. What if you added to my knowledge that I wouldn't have known on my own in the case of kohen levim Yisrael? Ihani lo b'chayv man b'chayv. I mean, if they're not chayv, so who is chayv? The Torah commands us in the mitzvah of shofar. Well, who's obligated in shofar? And the Gemara answers kohen mitzvah. There's a havamina that kohen would be part of from tkiyas shofar. There's the Maisa. Again, as far as Levim Yisrael is concerned, I don't need the Brisa, but the Brisa mentions all three groups of Jews in order to tell me that even Kohanim are chayiv in Tkiyah Shofar. I would have thought. With regard to Shofar, the Pasuk says, Yom Trua Yelachem. Which means that on this day you're chayev in shofar, as if to say that from the year that's made up of 365 days, we're going to isolate one particular day, and that's going to be your Yom Trua, and that addresses Mandolesa Ela B'Tkiyah D'Chad Yom. That addresses the entire population minus the Kohanim, as we'll see in a minute, who have no other day of the year in which they're obligated in shofar. So it makes sense that the Torah singles out Yom Trua, this day of Rosh Hashana, which is the only day they're obligated in shofar. But in the case of Kohanim, Hani Kohanim, Ol Visnehu, B'Tkiyah D'Kol Hashana, D'Chsiv Utkatim B'Chatzot Tzalol Sechem, etc. In Parashas Baloscha, the Kohanim are commanded to blow the shofar with the Chatzotzos over the Karbonos. And that applies the whole year round. Aim, I would have thought Lola Chayve. They're not Chayev in Tkiyah Shofar, because I read the pasuk very literally, Yom Trua. It's only on this day that you're obligated in shofar. But for the Kohanim, you can't say, well, you're Chayev in blowing the shofar on this day. They would have a Chayev to blow the shofar any day of the year as an accompaniment to the Karban Olah. Kamash Malon, so the Brisa tells me no, that even the Kohanim are Chayev in Tkiyah Shofar. The Gemara says, me dummy. What kind of equation do you have to the shofar blowing over the Karban Olah in the Beis HaMikdash? Hasam, there, Chatzotzos. They were blowing Chatzotzos at the time of that Krovas HaKarban. Hacha, here Rosh Hashanah, they're blowing a shofar. So even though Kohanim, you could say that they have one day of the year, like the rest of Klal Yisrael, maybe on Rosh Hashanah when they blow the shofar. So therefore, they're also included in Yom Trua Yeh Lochem. So I stand corrected. It seems like the Havamina of this Gemara is based on the fact that when they blew at the time of the Olos, they blew Chatzotzos, and the Gemara thought that we should make an equation between Chatzotzos and Shofros. And the Gemara said, no, that's not a fair equation. Those are two independent, separate mitzvahs. So now we're back to the drawing board. What was the Havamina that Kohanim would be exempt from the mitzvah Shofar? Ella, it's Salkadak. I would have thought whole Tanan. We have a Mishnah back on Daf Chavav, and that Mishnah, based on Xeris Shalom, equates Shalom. Yom Kippur Yovel, the Rosh Hashana, on Yom Kippur, going into the 50th year of Yovel, they blew the shofar. And it was exactly like the Rosh Hashanah blowing every year of the Tkiyah Shofar. and ula brachos, and as far as tefillas musaf, the 9 brachos that we recite, Malchus, Rosh Hashana. We're going to recite the same tefillas musaf, identical, on Yovel. Is therefore man the Isa b'mitzvahs hayovel, Isa b'mitzvahs shofar, the kiyas shofar. So anyone who's included in Yovel is included in the mitzvah of shofar. But Hanikat Kohanim, Hoil v'lesnu b'mitzvahs the Yovel, Kohanim are not included in the mitzvah of Yovel, which has to do with the field. And what rights do you have to buy back a field that you sold? And the Kohanim have different set of rules and regulations. And therefore, since the Kohanim are excluded from the mitzvah of Yovel, ipso facto, by virtue of the Gzeir Shava, they would be exempt likewise from the mitzvah of Shofar in the Havamim. The Snan, we learned in the Mishnah in Erechim, Kohanim Levim Mochrim Li'olam, V'Galim Li'olam. So we're talking about the sale of whether it's fields or real estate, meaning buildings and houses. And that subdivides into 2 categories. A category called Mechira, and then there's a category called Geula. And these laws apply to all of Klal Yisrael uniformly, with the exception of Kohen. So what are these 2 laws of Mochrim and Goel? In order to appreciate this, we have to talk about 2 categories of fields. What is a field called a stei achuza? Stei achuza means you inherited from your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, all the way back to the time that Yeshua divided up the land of Israel. And the special status of a stei achuza is that if you sell a stei achuza, which is part of the inheritance of your family, then the sale is considered a 2-year sale. I'll explain what I mean. And after that 2 years, when the lokach, the buyer, has already enjoyed your stei achuza for 2 years, then you can come around, you're the seller, and this was your inheritance, and you can buy it back against the will of the buyer. Again, the reason why the first 2 years you cannot buy it back is because every mechira is a minimum of 2 years. And therefore, the lokach has the right to say, at least I purchased it, I spent so much money, give me at least 2 years of produce from this land, of enjoying the ownership, possession over the land. After 2 years, then at that point, he has a right to be goel. And again, that means to pay the money and buy back the field. Now, if in event he does not utilize that right to be goel, and then when the Yovel comes, then we have a different halacha that the sados achozos be Yovel. Okay, so that's as far as Mechir is concerned. Again, we're talking about a stei achuza, and it's in an open walled city, and the first 2 years he cannot force the lokach to sell it back. Then we go on to a second category, which is the Geula category, and that's with regard to Bate Orechom. That means a house that's located in a walled city, and that wall was up there at the time that Yeshua entered into the land, like Josh got the Battle of Jericho. And a house that you own in an Orechoma, in a walled city, and it could be that now there's no wall, but there was a wall at the time of Yeshua, then you have rights called Geula. Geula means we'll give you up to, but not beyond, 12 months, the first 12 months subsequent to the Mechira, to be Goel Yesod. After that, he can no longer be Goel Yesod. After that 12-month period passes by. Whole Sugis and Shas, what happens if he gets there before midnight on the 12th month, at the end of the 12th month, but he can't cross the river to be Goel Yesod. Anyway, that's as far as these 2 categories vis-a-vis everyone but the Kohen. The Kohanim, on the other hand, were removed from this entire halacha of the limitations that apply to selling a field, whether it's a stei achuza, which regular sale, you cannot be goel within the first 2 years, or whether it's a bias be'ir mukefes choma mimos Yoshua, where you have up to but not beyond 12 months to be goel if you're not a Kohen. In the case of Kohanim, the halacha is that these time limitations don't apply. So, for example, a Kohen who sells a stei achuza would be okay to be golden even within the first 2 years. And in the case of Batei Arichoma, he could be golden even after a year. And all this depends upon a pasuk in Parshas Bahar. It says, "B'mispar shnei tfuos yimchar lo, amachir liolam ein apachos mishtei shanim." The Gemara established. And therefore, in a normal case of a mocher, except for a Kohen, he could be gold the son only after 2 years have passed by. That's as far as the stay achuz is concerned. And with regard to a bias in an ear mukefes choma, the pasuk says, "Im lo yigal ad melos lo shana tmim." If he doesn't redeem his field, this is for everyone but a Kohen, within 12 months, then become a bias shapir at shalom choma. Litzvisus liknos likonalos, that the Kohen, the buyer, has rights after the 12 months. He doesn't have to give it back. He writes here in the footnote, based on a mission in Erech, and I'm base bias be'ir she'enim ukefes choma yochal amocher legola af liacha she'ovra shona me'amachir. In any event, with regard to Kohanim, the law changes, and they're not limited by this 2-year minimum or by the impossibility of being goel after the year. Is therefore Ema, I would think, a mitzvah, the Rosh Hashana lo l'chayv, for the Kohanim should be exempt from shofar in the light of the equation that we have, Gzeret Shova, between shofar of Rosh Hashanah and shofar of Yovel. Kamash Malan, the Bryce wants to teach you, we don't say that. Even Kohanim achayv mitzvah of Tiyat shofar. Now let's not get too comfortable with Rav Huna, because we're going to reject Rav Huna. Uli atzmo motzi. A chatzi eved chatzi mechorin can certainly blow the shofar for himself, because anyone could be a motzi himself. Amalei Rav Nachman Rav Huna made a big mistake. Because why is it that he cannot blow shofar for someone else who's not a ben chorim, who's a total ben chorim? It's because lo osi tzad avdus mepik tzad cherus, because half of this eved is an eved, and that tzad avdus, that half that's an eved, is also participating in the blowing of the shofar. And the kol shofar that's produced by this chatzi eved is to some extent 50% a kol shofar that's not a kol shofar, because it's coming from the tzad avdus shofar. Is memela li atzmo nami lo osi tzad avdus tidei u'matik tzad cherus tidei. When he himself blows the shofar, half of the blower is the eved shibo, and the kol that comes out of the eved is a kol that's not a kol shofar, because it's part from the shofar. And therefore, when he himself, his tzad cherus, hears the shofar, he's hearing the shofar from the half of the tzad avdus. Elom Rav Nachman, and therefore we have to come to the following conclusion: Af atzmo liatzmo, and a motzi cannot be motzi himself. With Kia Shofar, Tanya Nami Hochi, we have a price to support this. Misha Chetzio, Eved, Chetzio Ben Chorin, Afli Atzmo, Eino Motzi. Ani Ava Berei Rabbi Zeir Kol, Abrochas Kulon Afpish Kfar Yotza Motzi. When it comes to Birchas HaMitzvos, even if I was already Yotze the mitzvah, I could still make the bracha on your behalf because of the din of Arvus, that we share a chiyuv. And if I wasn't then it's as if now lo yatzidei chavos, as if you yourself aren't yatzidei chavos, because you share that chiyuv. But that's as far as mitzvahs. Chutz mi birchas lechem u birchas hayayim. These are birchas haden, where the bracha is generated by the hana that you get. And if you're not getting any hana from it, then you don't have a bracha. Your bracha is a bracha she'en tzricha. It's totally unnecessary. If he hasn't eaten yet or drunk any wine, then he's obligated the mitzvah of yayin. If there's someone of bracha, and if someone else wants to drink wine or eat bread, you share the same chiyuv, and then you can be motzi. But however, if he already made his bracha on the lechem or the yayin, And now he simply wants to make a bracha only to be moti someone else. Eino motzi, he cannot make a bracha on behalf of someone else because he doesn't share the chova. He doesn't have that iser of also lehenos miolam azeblo bracha. Therefore, there's no arvus. You don't share the same to you.